please. The floor is
Yes,
yours.
hello everybody in Korea, and very nice to speak to you and those listening worldwide. It's a great honor to have been asked to provide this keynote, and I look forward to your questions at the end going from here. So I'll now just share my screen here to ensure that you can see what is going on. So I'm talking today, as indeed everybody is, about my data. And it's often seen as focusing on privacy, security, and consent. And indeed, those are at the heart of the whole my data principle. But the reality is there's a second key point. And that is, by adopting my data, we improve and increase the use of personal data. And we make it simple. So instead of a complex, insecure, non-private data exchange, we end up with a simple, private, secure, and consented data exchange. And that's what I hope to be able to show you today. So as a company, Digimi's mission is to help everybody make better use of their personal data. And that's the mission of my data. And we're not the only company, and you'll hear quite a few today. I will talk generically about my data, but use Digimi as an example so that you can see how it works in day-to-day life. If we actually look across not just finance, but personalized health, consumer, retail, yes, fintech, smart cities, all of those new aspects, things that we want to do, require rich consumer data. And if they're going to get that rich consumer data, it must be with privacy, security, and consent baked in. Yet we're in a world where it seems that the use of personal data is being constrained because of consumer concerns with privacy and security and legislation. We have GDPR in Europe and similar all around the world. And so it seems that because for the last 20 years of the internet, our personal data has been taken from behind us, being tracked, that we want to constrain the use of our personal data. But if that was all that we did, then the future of personalized health, of personalized finance, retail, IoT, smart cities, would not come to fruition. So we need to find a way to share that data, but leave the individual in control and have privacy, security, and consent. So if we look at this from the perspective of a service that wants to provide value to me, the individual. If you look at it today, before my data, it's a challenging world. It's actually difficult to source the data. Do you get it from third parties? Do you try and track me? How do you do that? If you do that, or you buy it from third parties, it's of highly variable quality. It can be anything to 40 to 60% wrong. For many years, Google felt that I was a 28-year-old female because of the things that I bought for my wife and daughter. Data also comes in lots of incompatible data formats. The way we store health data is different in all sorts of different systems. And because of that 1 to 3, if we are to do anything meaningful, it requires complex and extensive data analytics. That is then expensive and time consuming. And it means very few companies can really use the personal data to do things that we want. And then we have the issues of the regulatory privacy and trust. But if we follow my data as a principle, we're going to change where that data is sourced from. We're going to source it direct from the individual. And you'll see in the next 20 minutes that makes it easy to access richer personal data. And it is rich, high quality data, direct from source and validated as such. So it is my bank transactions if I wish to share them. It is my health record, my wearables directly, not inferred, not of variable quality, but rich, high quality. Because it's going to come to a single point at the individual, it allows us to have a system which normalizes the data into a single format, making it much easier to use. And the 1 to 3 with my data means that actually you can get the features that you need to provide the new services for individuals with much less analytics complexity. And it's also much, much simpler and inexpensive and quick to start. So you can do things much, much more quickly. And it's 100% private, fully secure, consented, and crystal clear to the individual to get trust. So we end up with a system that provides us more and better data, easier, simple, and private, secure, and consented. So what's not to like? So let's look at the details of it. So why do we need my data? Why is the existing system not adequate? And it's actually because our data is stuck in different stovepipes. It's stuck in places that it's not easy to get access to, or it's controlled by businesses or entities that don't necessarily want to share it. But if we recognize 3 critical insights, we can change the model. The first is only I know where all my data is. Only I know which hospitals and doctors and wearable devices I use. Do I use Apple Health? Do I use Fitbit? Do I use a Samsung device? Who knows? I know. Which social networks do I use? I know. And then I generally have a right of access to a full copy of my data. I've nearly always had that, and now it's becoming a digital right. And then crucially, only I have unlimited usage rights to my data. I can take my medical records, print them off, put them on the windows of my car, and drive around Seoul if I want to. Show the world. If anyone else did that, it would be a privacy breach and a fine or prison. But I can do what I want to with my data. And therefore, if we understand those 3 points, the only way we can bring rich data together is at the individual. It's the only technical way it can be done. And the good news is that privacy, security, and consent comes for free. So how do we do that? Well, individuals aren't going to somehow develop the software themselves to link to the banks and the hospitals and the social networks. So we have a class of software called a data facilitator or my data operators. Data facilitator is the term the unit uses. And that's what DigiMe is. We don't access the data for our own purposes. In fact, DigiMe doesn't see, touch, or hold the data. But we act as a facilitator to bring the data to an individual and then enable the individual to share the data. And this works very simply. It puts the individual at the center. The individual requests their bank data, so DigiMe will get it for them. Social data, DigiMe will get it for them. Health data, the same. That data is then put in a personally encrypted library that's decentralized. There's no centralized storage and keys. In fact, DigiMe doesn't hold the keys, so we can't access the data. Only the individual can control and access that data. And then we have a consent stack, which you'll see in operation a bit later, which allows any app or web service to ask the individual for their data. And if the value exchange is one that the individual wants, so it might be a diabetes app, for example, that wants to keep me healthy. That's a good value exchange. I want to stay healthy. So I'll even pay for the app, and I will allow it to maybe see my medications and my wearables data so it can give me my tailored advice. And so therefore, if that value exchange is one I want, I will consent, and DigiMe enables the transfer of the data. And then I also have the ability to see my data, search it, and have a consent dashboard so I can control everything. So this is the simple diagram of how my data works. But there is a problem with this. And the problem is, even though we as individuals care about privacy and security and consent, and we can see that in numerous surveys, we don't care enough to take a physical action. we're not going to manage our data. And in fact, people find it struggle to manage important things like finance. So asking them to manage something as difficult as data isn't going to happen. So I think in 2, 3, certainly no more than 5 years' time, we'll all understand that having our data is of huge value to us because of all the areas, the value propositions on the right of this diagram that allow us to use it. But that isn't the case now. We need to learn that. So one of the big lessons that we've learned in the last 5 years is simplify, simplify, simplify. Make it really easy for apps and services to move into the My Data world. Make it easy for individuals to move into that world so that we can go from the bad to the good and the better very easily. So we've designed our service to be a full SaaS service that an Apple service can speak to an individual who's never heard of My Data, yet can ask them for consent, can invoke DigiMe, get the data and bring it into the Apple service without, in fact, the individual ever having had used a My Data service before. And that's how we grow the ecosystem and bring everything together. And then what does that enable? Well, you can get data and do what we do today in lots of situations, understand group characteristics and behaviors. But actually, it allows us to unlock previously impossible use cases in personalized health. And I'll get to that a little bit more, but in consumer engagement, in fintech, and in every aspect of individuals' lives. We can now tailor everything using rich personal data, but do it ethically. Do it with privacy, security, and consent at its heart. And it doesn't matter what the data is. Once you have a system like this that's working, you can plug in financial data, as in fact Korea have done. But elsewhere in Europe, for example, we've got medical records, social networks, wearables, fintech, social, etc. And the same principle, the same data facilitator can work in across geographies. We work in North America, South America, Europe, Middle East, and Australia already. And the key here is it's not just about doing it more ethically, so the bad way to a good way. It's actually about making richer, higher quality data available so that actually, as a service, as a business, as a government, as a researcher, you get more data and better data, provided, of course, the individual consents. And the data facilitator, we operate on behalf of the individual and, in fact, on behalf of the business to connect the two for the data transfer. But it's really important that we are just a facilitator. We're not seeing the data. We're not selling the data. We're getting it, putting it into the private store of the individual and encrypting it, controlling it there so that the individual has full control, and then providing a consent framework so services can ask individuals can say yes and or no, and subsequently no, and data can flow. So we're just like a courier company or the national grid bringing electricity from the power stations to the home. We're not actively looking at the data, selling the data. It is the individuals, and the value exchange is between the individual and the business or service. And all of this is based upon two really key words. When a service asks an individual, it must be with explicit, that means clear, directed for a single purpose, and informed, making it absolutely clear. So one of the keys is how you show that consent. And we have here a consent certificate that we've designed, and we modified over time, but this has been proven to be very clear. So who is asking you for data? What purpose are they asking? What is actually going to happen to it? Is it an ongoing share, one-off? Will my data leave my device or not? Will it be shared with third parties? Will it be kept? Things like that, so that I know as an individual exactly what I'm doing. Because if I know, then I'm likely to share the data for that value proposition. And how easy then is this for a business? How easy is it for a business to move to my data? Well, taking our company's implementation as an example, it's inordinately easy. You can be accessing rich personal data if you have a value proposition that individuals like in hours, literally hours. All you have to do is register for the consent certificate so that you're very clear. We know we can show the individual exactly what you're asking for. You then receive a token that represents that consent certificate. And whenever in your app or your web service you would like the data, you literally just push that token into our API and the miracle happens. And we're going to see that live in a moment. So it is inordinately simple. It's much, much, much simpler than trying to do it the wrong way or the bad way from third parties and others. It is not only better data, it is simpler data. So how does this display? How would an individual see this request? Well, the request comes from the service. So here we have an app called Consentry. Consentry was created during COVID to digitize lateral flow devices and to keep you a test record of it. So let's say that this app also wants to be able to import your vaccine records. So you've got a single place for your lateral flow tests you've done at home and your vaccine records. So to do that, the app wants to connect to Digimi because Digimi's already got the interfaces to the various health portals and works for the individual. So the app will have registered for a consent certificate. It puts that into the API, and immediately Digimi will display the consent certificate to the individual. So why, what data, what will happen to it, ability to see extra data. And then if the individual agrees, they have to give a positive swipe. Then they have to authenticate the channel. So Digimi has to go and get the data, in this case from the UK National Health Service. And then what happens in the background is Digimi gets the data from the NHS, the whole medical record, stores that in the individual's personal vault, library, wallet, locker, whatever you want to call it. We call it a library. Encrypts it, and then looks at the consent certificate and says, what do they want? And in this case, they just want the vaccine data. So Digimi extracts just the data that is applicable to the consent certificate, normalizes it into a standard form, and then sends it to the app, which can then do whatever it wants. In this case, simply displays it. Now, the app may have other things that it wants to say about that, but the point is that Digimi, it's frictionless. Consent, authorization, everything else happens in the background. And that makes it easy for services to move from doing things the wrong way to doing it the My Data way, which, remember, gets them more and better data, but it is inordinately simple. And I'll keep saying those words. So to achieve that, there's quite a lot of technology that we've had to implement. How do we get data from everywhere, deal with it? How do we store it, normalize it, and deal with consent? So we have quite a tech stack to enable that all to happen, to enable it to happen securely, such that we don't see the data, that it is highly secure. We've been penetration tested by governments and tier one companies and others. And because it's a fully distributed system with no central key repository, etc., then it's inordinately difficult to hack. Never has been, but if it was, you'd at most you would get one person's data and not anybody else's. But as I said, it is so secure that that hasn't happened, and we intend to keep it that way. But despite the complexity of the stack, it's available via a very simple API and SDK, so that all of that complexity is hidden from businesses. Now, when you're dealing with personal data, I personally believe it's really important to be at the highest levels of security and accreditations. And we've made it a policy of our company so to do, and I think that's important for any company. We've got our ISO accreditations, various other health accreditations. We run to the highest technical operational standards. You cannot treat the security models and everything else lightly. You are bringing personal data together, and therefore that has to be a core capability of anybody who is acting as a data facilitator. The good news is that that's all there and inherent in the system, so any service inherits that quality, that security, the privacy, and the consent. So what are the benefits for businesses and hence the economy as a whole? Well, it's better data, quickly and simply. So you can do almost anything that you want to do that. It's much, much more simple. So there are huge cost and effort savings in actually getting access to that data. There's a lot less compliance effort because you don't necessarily need to keep the data. If you can always go back to the individual, you can receive the data, process it, and then throw it away. You don't have to keep it. You don't have that data necessarily in your systems. Now, some solutions need to keep it, but a lot of them don't. In fact, many solutions could just do it as an app on my phone. So I can have a diabetes app, share my medications and my wearables data, and that data never leaves me as such. It just goes to the app on my phone. So there's an ability to make it simpler, cheaper across the board as we implement. And of course, we gain the trust of individuals. Individuals are more likely to share their data in this world so that they can get access to these new and better services. So this all sounds marvelous. We'd like to sign up now, but is it really real? That's a good question, right? We're just talking about this. We have talked about it for a while. We've been implementing for a while. Is it usable? Is it safe? Is it scalable? Will businesses adopt it? Well, of course, I'm going to tell you the answer to all of those is yes, but I want to prove that to you. So is it real? Well, either now on your phones or after this conference, you can go to play.digi.me, choose the demo, and see for yourself. Share some social data. All that's going to happen, in fact, is that it's going to be displayed on screen. So this is exactly what happens if you go to play.digi.me. You select demo, try the demo mode, and what it's going to do is ask you to share some social data, which it will display on the screen. So you're seeing here instantly how DigiMe came in. This is a real-time recording, by the way. It is a recording because of making sure it works on screen. So you saw the consent certificate now authorizing the Twitter stream. So DigiMe is now collecting the data from Twitter, many, many years worth, storing that in the library of the individual, encrypting it, looking at the consent certificate, pulling out, in this case, I think only 3 months worth, normalizing that data and sending it to this web service to display, as you can see on the screen. And in the time it took me to explain all that, it happened. So this is real. It is actually real. It works today for health data, finance, social, etc. And you can prove it yourself as you go through. And here, the gentleman who did this video is showing how he can then move off to go to see the actual tweets himself. So importantly, it is real. It works today. We as a company have it all working with all of these different data feeds and different other companies the same. So is it worth doing? It sounds like it's worth doing. I hope it sounds like it's worth doing from what I'm telling you. But we've actually studied it. We've had lots of engagement with governments, tier one companies, big pharmaceuticals, for example, major credit card companies, banks, retailers. And this was a piece of work done in the UK a few years ago by a very good consultancy called Control Shift, who works in this area, showing even at the earliest stages that it would have a 27.8 billion. I never quite know how they come up with the points in this in these studies, but a significant impact in year one on the economy. And there are other reports that show for the EU, for example, it would be worth over €1 trillion. So we've also done full data mobility, my data work with major companies, including those that you might think are against this, like Facebook, who actually do support data portability. So this was a study done in 2019. That's 3 years ago. And a lot of work's been done since. But this was a major study with lots of people all involved together, and unusual to get everybody together. You'll be able to see the presentation later, so I'm not going to go through what they all said, but essentially it was highly successful. And that particular study proved that personal data sharing can be made safe with a data facilitator like DigiMe, that it enabled huge valuable services to be created. But it is important, as I think one of the early speakers said, that you've got that breadth of data, not just finance, but social and health and wearables, so that there is everything needed to be able to move forwards. Now, health is in itself a really good example, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail, because actually all around the world, we've tried to bring patient data together and failed in many cases. Yet we, as a world, want to move to what we call personalized medicine, medicine that's about me, very specifically about me, with my full history. So I was speaking to the doctor today about a lung issue because when I was a young lad, I had a major accident and ruptured diaphragm and collapsed lung. That's very, very specific to me. What the doctor needs to do is very specific to my circumstances, and my O2 intake might be less than yours. So being able to share my wearables data and other information is very important to any app, any research, and actually any doctoral intervention for me. Yet we can't do that. If we look at the healthcare data ecosystem today, then there's some data shared, not much within the healthcare facilities. We rarely get a full record. A little bit can get shared with research, but very complex without the patients giving their consent. Most of the patient-derived data isn't used anywhere in our medical world. Consumer apps find it really difficult to do anything for us, let alone any healthcare apps, because they can't get access to the data. And this is the situation in nearly every single health system in the world. Now, we could try and wire up everything. We could try and do a many-to-many link. We could probably spend hundreds of billions and still not get there trying to do that. Or we could spend a few million. I really mean that, a few million. We have already done this in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Iceland, and partially in the US. It doesn't take a lot because it's point to point. So if I can get my data from my GP in my hospitals and then from my own data, I can share it back, all of it, a combined total healthcare record. We don't have to have all of these trying to communicate with each other. They just communicate with the individual. Vastly more simple and vastly better data for everybody, and an ability to move us forwards. And this is so important that the EU, for example, has said that every citizen should have access in this way by 2030. Now, it's happening faster. As I said, we've already done the UK, the Dutch, Iceland, and some of the US, and looking at it for other nations too. Right? The Dutch, I would say, for example, are leading. They have a program called MEDMI, MEDMIJ, where they're actively encouraging it and actually subsidizing companies like ourselves to make it easier to bring that to the individual. So health, clear advantages. But we've done studies and lots of work here with two major brands. Most of you will have heard of MasterCard, CX Loyalty, which looked at how having that better data from the individual with the trust of the individual, that we can actually have much, much more interactive and useful shopping experiences across retail. Here, MasterCard, in a presentation they did themselves to the Maidata Forum, talked across the piece, not just finance, but not just credit decisioning, but advertising, health, loyalty, even fun and social apps. So across the piece, having access to better data will make a big difference. And you can see from here insurance decisioning, credit decisioning, personal finance management, just in small areas, a significant difference if you can get the quality of data that Maidata provides. So to summarize, in that sense, by going via the individual, you make it simpler, easy access to richer personal data. You make the data better because it's direct from source and validated as such. When the individual shares their bank data, you know, because of the data facilitator and how it happened, that that is their bank data. That is their wearables data. It's 100% accurate. Not all data facilitators, but certainly Digimi, we go to the extent of normalizing all the data. So it doesn't matter if the health services have different ways of storing the data, it comes out in one form. So therefore, you can now get moving faster because you don't have to go all the way up to AI and everything else. You can actually, with relatively simple analytics, pull out very important features that enable new use cases. And because of the 1 to 4, it really is inexpensive and quick to start. As I would say, the only thing you need is a value proposition, something that the individual will say, yes, for that, I will share my data. And the good news is that it's completely ethical. It's 100% private, fully secure, regulatory compliant all around the world, and you gain trust. So I want to be clear, my data is not just about privacy, security, and consent. It's about making it simpler and enabling us to share more and better, rich personal data. So it empowers the personal data economy. It increases the velocity of personal data. We know that velocity of money is GDP. If we can increase the velocity, the more sharing under the control of the individual, we will increase the economy, we will increase health, which in itself has an economic benefit, will provide tailored capabilities across the spectrum. So it opens new pathways to greater economic activity, delivering greater value to all, individuals, businesses, governments, and society. And I'm just going to, before I finish and then take some questions, emphasize on the government side. This isn't just about the banks opening up their data and the social networks and the wearables, but it's about government opening up its data about me. It's about my health data. Even getting my tax data back from the government is inordinately useful, because what better way to prove my income than what I declared, because I rarely over declare on tax. So, and it enables governments to be able to access data with my consent that they find very difficult to do laterally. So everybody in the ecosystem, whether the individual, whether it's a business, researchers, governments, the whole of society benefits from a Maidata ecosystem. And all you need to do to encourage Maidata is ensure that you have data portability with a well-formed API. So thank you very much for listening today. It's been a great honor to explain the power of human centricity, the power of my data. You can prove it yourself by going to play.digi.me. If you want to understand how easy it is to use, you can go to developers.digi.me. You can also go to mydata.org, which is the global organization looking at my data principles across the world. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm always very happy to receive those at julian@digi.me. I will say that 3 different students sent me questions before this session today, and I was very pleased to answer those. So always feel free to ask a question at any time. And with that, I think we now open up to questions that have either been submitted or from the floor. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Julian Ranger, Chairman of Digimi. And we have received some questions in advance, and we have also received some real-time questions from the live audience. And let me give you some of the questions that has been received beforehand. Digimi is about collecting and storing personal data and provides the data platform for providing the data to customers. So what was the reason, what incentivized you to come up with such a service in the first place?
This is fascinating. I'll give a slightly deep answer to that, in fact. The answer is that I was very lucky as a young lad. I was an aeronautical engineer and I worked on fighter aircraft, and I got involved at the very beginning of what we would now call the military internet, passing data around aircraft, ships, tanks, etc. And in fact, I built a worldwide business doing that called Stasis, which I eventually sold to Lockheed Martin. And I became, through right time and place, a world expert on networks, data, and interoperability. And one thing that we learned through all of that work through the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s was how inordinately difficult, very, very difficult it was to get all this data transferred on a many-to-many principle. And one of the things that we did to simplify things and make it work was to aggregate it at a single point and then redistribute it. There's a big program in the US called BACN, BACN, and still continues to this day that does that, that I helped create. And when I left and I retired from doing the military stuff in about 2007, I set up an innovation hub and was investing in looking at various businesses. And privacy and personal data kept coming up. And it just suddenly hit me that the reality was that if this was a solution we'd had to do for the military, it was clear that we had to find a way of aggregating personal data. But then it was also clear that we couldn't do that as a business. It had to be at the individual. And then you get the whole of my data, and in my instance, the Digimi company. So it was really looking at networking, data, and interoperability in one area showed the way forward in the other area. And I think particularly it showed the way forward for simplicity, making it simpler. And that's a key thing.
Thank you very much. Let me move on to the second question. In Korea, only the financial industry is using the My Data. Other industries are not so active in sharing the personal data yet. Digimi started with finance, healthcare, SNS. So what was the reason you were able to expand the scope into these industries? Did you also, what kind of incentives did you provide to the information sharing entities?
Well, we don't provide incentives to the information sharing entities. We say to them, it's a right for your customers to have the data. And then we have to work hard to persuade them and to show that it's better for them to give the data back because their customers are happier. Now, in fact, many of the companies believe that themselves too. So if we take Facebook, we can rightly criticize Facebook for many things about privacy and others, and it's not really the subject of today to do so. But interestingly, Facebook believe that it is right that their users should access and have a copy of all of their data. And so therefore they support us in getting the data, as do Twitter and Instagram and various others. When it came to medical data, it was about showing the governments that actually this improves the whole of the health system. So we managed to get onto the contract vehicles in various countries to get that access. But then some countries are moving forwards faster. So Holland, I mentioned. In the US, they've got an act of Senate Act called the Meaningful Use 3 Act, which makes it a requirement that anybody in health can give the data back to patients. So it's a combination of using APIs that are there and that are open, talking to governments, talking to the various entities to make it happen. So it has been a lot of work because we're a leader in this area, but it's now happening more and more. So I think, as your other opening speakers said, they're looking to change the law in Korea to enforce it to happen for health and presumably other sectors, as indeed GDPR in Europe has done.
네, 고맙습니다. 마이데이터에 대한
Thank you very much. The social atmosphere for my data was positive probably in those countries. Let me move on to the next question, which was on the YouTube. The cloud, blockchain, AI, how do you think they will combine with my data for future growth and evolution?
So cloud, we're a full cloud service. I think many things are today, and you can do that with decentralized, etc. Now, we actually don't use blockchain at all, and blockchain or any type of chain is not, in my view, appropriate to storing, holding personal data. There's no requirement for it in that sense. The data is encrypted, it's held in personal stores. No doubt, however, that there will be areas where those technologies come in. So blockchain, for example, to record in certain high value instances, the consent handshake may well be something that comes in. It isn't necessary, but it may be something that is desirable going forwards. So we've implemented this full decentralized stack without blockchain from there. In terms of AI, the more and better data you get, the better you can make AI. So yes, there is no doubt that my data will improve the AI capabilities, and then that will come back in itself to improve the services. But I do want to take you back to one of the points I made in my presentation, that by having access to more and better data, richer data, you actually can get a lot more out of the data without having to go to the complexities of AI. So that you can take the first steps on this ladder of providing more utility with my data without having to have AI systems and everything else, with relatively straightforward algorithms. So my data will certainly empower, make better AI, but you also can do a lot more with straightforward algorithms as well.
네, 고맙습니다. 정말 많은 분들께서 유튜브로 질문 올려주고
Many people are posting questions, so let me move on to the next question.
이렇게 마이데이터 비즈니스를
In carrying out the My Data business, what was your biggest challenge?
부탁드리겠습니다.
You noticed I laughed a little because there were quite a few challenges. The biggest challenge actually was being too early. In any business, it's great if you arrive just at the time when everybody's interested. We were too early, and that's made it difficult for us financially sometimes, but we've survived through that, and now it's the right time, and it's enabled us to have a lot of experience. So now I'm going to say, well, it was wonderful. But that was the biggest challenge, because you're having to learn. You're having to learn what's the right balance of security versus friction. So you heard me talk in the presentation about how we've made it frictionless, really simple to use, because simplicity is the key to getting this done. So there's a lot of learnings that we've had to do. And as one of the first in the business, that you have to learn the hard way. But the end result is that you end up with a better product and a better understanding. But I would say that the key challenge we've had is being early, and therefore you're having to explain everything the whole time. Whereas in a few years' time, I really do believe that the world will say, well, hasn't it always been this way? Why did we do it any other way? Because it's going to be simpler and better data. But at the moment, it's being early, getting people to understand is the challenge.
네, 고맙습니다. 마이데이터 분야의 선구자로서 겪으신 어려운 점에 대해서.
So that was the challenge you had to experience as the early comer to the market. Next question is, what kind of security policies do you use for my data?
Okay, well, there are many, and it's not a single answer to that question. It's a multi-layered answer, because data has to be encrypted at rest and in transit. All the data that is held in these individual vaults is individually encrypted for the individual, but in fact, each item is separately encrypted with a random number, and then that random number encrypted by the individual's key, and then the keys are split and not held in one place and controlled by the individual. There are multiple layers to the SAS processing, so that it's what we call stateless. So when a small piece of data has been processed, passed on, there's nothing left in the cloud. There's all sorts of other controls you have to do in the business. So for example, our developers don't have access to the production environments. We have our own firewall between that, and as stuff passes, we have policies and procedures under ISO 27001 for the creation of any master keys we have for encryption and other things like that. So when one talks about security, there's no one answer to that. You have to have multiple layers of security at all levels. And then the final thing you have to do is be audited and get people to try and penetrate to you. So we've had governments and health services and others do that. And you learn if there are any weaknesses from that very quickly. So it's a real multi-layer, multi-set problem that you have to solve and continue to solve on a regular basis.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문은요.
Next question is, in Korea, within this year, we are going to expose and disclose public health record to the My Data service providers. So what kind of considerations do you think we should have in using the My Data?
Well, actually, it's you say you're going to disclose it to the My Data operator. You specifically shouldn't be. A My Data operator shouldn't be seeing or doing the data. Remember, we said we don't see, touch, and hold the data. So what you're actually doing is giving the data from the GP, the hospital, the pharmacy, back to the individual. Well, surely the individual should be able to see their data. And then the individual can make the choice of who they share it to. So in my presentation, I had 3 slides which showed patient centricity, the utmost importance of doing it. It's the only way to move forward for personalized medicine. So rather than be concerned, you should be pushing for it to happen as quickly as possible. But of course, any My Data operator that is connecting to the medical system should be qualified, as I showed you, should be assessed for its privacy, security, and indeed safety, which is the extra piece. So, for example, when we connect up to the UK, the Dutch, the Icelandic, and the US health services, as we do at the moment, we've been safety audited to make sure that when data comes, it gets stored, it doesn't get mislabeled or anything else. Because if we received type 1 diabetes and we pushed it out as type 2, that could have a problem for an individual. So one has to be ensure that the data facilitators are qualified, but it's the best thing you can do is provide health data to the individual. And again, just to point out, the EU wants that to happen to every citizen no later than 2030. So the earlier you do it, the better.
네, 고맙습니다. 마이데이터 분야에 대한 관심이 크고 또 회장
There's a lot of interest about my data, and many people seem to have enjoyed the presentation. Another question.
강연 중에 더 좋은
During your
데이터를
presentation,
가진
you
자료를
have always said the
더
more
좋은
accurate
데이터라는
data,
무엇을
the better
의미하시는지
data. What do you actually
더
mean by
설명해
better
드리겠습니다.
data?
Okay, so when you try and get data from behind me by tracking me or whatever else, you're usually inferring things about me through sort of actions I take. But if you can actually see my bank transactions, or you can see my actual medications, or you can see my posts, that is real data that is much, much higher quality and much, much richer, and you can do things with. So instead of being anything 40 to 60% wrong, it's 100% right. And that's the key. It is much richer, better data upon which decisions, on which tailoring can be done.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. Another question was in English. Let me explain that in Korea. As previously asked, the Republic of Korea provides data platform services organized by the government, and companies need to get permission to access the data. It may be somewhat different from the data business model in the UK. I wonder if there is any example of data-related policy in the UK and how companies are dealing with them.
Well, the only real policy at the moment in the UK, like the EU, is the General Data Protection Regulation. But it is important because it not only has the privacy rules to protect the bad way of doing things, it has data portability and the requirements for explicit informed consent. And as I said during my presentation, those two things are critical to making my data work. There is one failure in Europe and in the UK, and that is that they specified data portability but didn't mandate that it had to be by APIs or by a well-formed API. And so we're trying to get that changed, and it seems that may be changed in the EU in the next year or two. So GDPR was very good because it mandated portability and explicit informed consent in 2018, but it had that minor flaw. But that has been definitely a driver and a help in this area.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문.
Thank you very much. Another question is 디지미, my data. What's your profit model or revenue model for your company?
Very good question, and people should ask that question. So first and foremost, we do not profit from the data. We don't see, touch, and hold the data. The value proposition is between the individual and the service. We're just a courier, a company. So we charge the requesting service 10 US cents each time data flows, but we cap that at $3 per person per use case per year. So we're literally trying to take the least amount of money. We're just a courier company. We don't care what's in the envelope. We just charge for the transfer, if you like. And then the value proposition of the data is between the individual and the service requesting it. So 10 cents capped at $3 per person per year.
네, 고맙습니다. 더 많은 질문 드리고 싶지만 마지막으로 한 질문.
So this is going to be the last question
보내드려야 될 것 같습니다.
before we let you go. The last question is about data. In getting the consent from individuals, what would be the best way to get the consent from users for using the data? Consent from the individuals for letting them use the data.
So the best way is having a very good use case. It's as simple as that. If there's something that I want, then and I understand it, then I will share my data. So you need a use case and you need to be able to express that easily. So I used an example of a diabetes app in the presentation. So the app says, if you give me your medications and your wearables data, I will be able to give you personalized recommendations to keep you healthier than if I didn't have that data. That's a value proposition that I as an individual can say, actually, I want better recommendations for my health. Here's my data. I will say yes. So it's all down to your use case and your value proposition and being able to express that clearly. And if you've got that, then people, and there's plenty of evidence to show people will share the data. So with that, I'll just add that it has been an honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you all today, and thank you very much for that. And if there are any questions that have been unanswered, then please send them to me at julian@digi.me, and I'll be very happy to answer them in due course or via the organizers who can send them to me afterwards. Thank you.
네, 줄리안 회장님 감사합니다. 열띤 강연과
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and also your very kind answers to many questions that we've had. Thank you so much for being with us.